The tulips were still trembling in my hands when she said it. "Pack your desk, Charlotte. You're done here." The room held its breath like a glass bowl. The sunlight through the glass wall cut the mahogany table into harsh strips of light. Hazel Winters smiled as if she had practiced that exact angle. Her voice was the precise tone of a woman announcing an audit. Efficient, final, without apology. Around us, faces blurred. My fingers closed tighter on the stems until water sloshed against the cardboard. The red petals shook like someone else's pulse. In that instant, everything I knew about myself, the late nights, the flights, the last-minute deals stitched together in hotel corridors and airport lounges, telescoped into the flutter of those flowers. 23 years at Ashford Industries, piled into a bouquet and an instruction to go. You don't expect humiliation to have a sound, but it does. It was the low rustle of the termination packet sliding across the table to my name. It was the shuffle of shoes toward the door. It was Maya's throat-catching as she stepped back, pretending to examine a spreadsheet on her tablet. The security guards, Mike and Travis, stood a little too still, the way everyone does when an office becomes a small theater. Hazel's assistant looked at the floor. Marcus Webb, the board member who had always smiled with too many teeth, didn't smile at all. He looked away. I thought I would react. I'd rehearsed responses to everything. Takeover bids, hostile offers, worse. I had counseled clients through firings that were kinder on paper. But now, as the words sunk in, the only thing that moved was the pen in my jacket pocket. Eleanor's fountain pen. I had felt its cool weight every time I signed something of consequence for 20 years. For years it had been the small built-in truth that I carried, a line of continuity between a mentor and a protege. I held it without thinking, thumb rubbing the engraved initials. Hazel leaned forward as if to whisper across the mahogany. "This is best for the company," she said, like any good villain who believes her own PR. "New leadership, new direction. We need decisive change." Decisive change, I repeated, even as the absurdity of the phrase scraped at me. Change could be decisive and merciless. It could break what people had built. It could be a clean break or something that left fractures you couldn't see until years later. I had been part of those years. I had been there when Ashford was a small West Coast supplier, and then again when it became 3 continents and a boardroom with a view that never let you forget who you were. I should have left then. The meeting was over, the cameras of faceless corporate life rolling on. People clapped because clapping is the polite mode of the animal that stands when alpha shifts take place. Maya hovered to collect my mug as if collecting a relic. She pressed a folded note into my hand as she passed. "Call me when you're ready," it said in her neat script. Her eyes were kind and furious at once. There was a grief there I recognized, not just for me, but for all of us, for the way systems swallow people. I stepped back through the glass into a corridor that seemed to lengthen with every step. The elevator doors parted with a sigh. I could have left then and never come back. I could have driven out of the city and never looked behind me. But what I couldn't do, what the room of colleagues had tried to force me into, was to pretend those 23 years were worthless. The tulips in the cardboard box thumped against one another, patient and absurd, and the pen in my pocket felt heavier than I remembered. If you asked me in that hallway what mattered most, I would have said the people who depended on Ashford, the line workers in Plant 3, the R&D team who had stayed when offers came and went, the small suppliers who trusted that our checks would clear. I would have told you, in a voice steady enough for them, that companies are not trophies. I would have told you that loyalty is not a ledger entry. But that's the thing about being inside a story. You don't get to narrate your importance. You only get to survive your own chapter. It is tempting to frame this as a clean break. The villain arrives, the protagonist is cast aside, and the world pivots. Real life isn't a movie. Real life gives you flashbacks. I was 20 when I first walked into Ashford's lobby. It smelled of lemon cleaner and the faint ghost of printed ink. Eleanor Ashford met me at the reception with a hand that looked at once fragile and rooted. She wore the same ascot she would wear in her 40s and her 60s, a small line of rebellion against time. She took me to a room where the sunlight pooled on a table and handed me a copy of The Art of War. "Read this," she said, "but don't be fooled. It's not about war. It's about knowing which fight to pick." She made me stay late the first week. We sat in her office, she with a brandy and I with a soda, while she told me stories about the company as if it were a living thing with opinions. She spoke of failures and reversals, obscure acquisitions that mended broken supply chains, and people she'd kept on because talent sometimes needed shelter. She taught me to listen more than to speak. She taught me the usefulness of silence, not as cowardice, but as a mode of seeing. There was a night in Seattle that taught me more about endurance than any book. We were expanding into a market that smelled of rain and risk. The numbers were merciless, the partners inconsistent, and the plane rides grew thin with the weight of deals that slipped away like nets. A critical plant that should have been operational in 90 days lagged to 6 months. I remember standing on a loading dock with a foreman who had worked for Ashford since before I was born, and realizing that this expansion was not a line on a slide deck. It was people's wages, their breakfasts, their children's tuition. We pulled nights into mornings. We rewrote supply chains. We slept on a couch once for 48 hours because it was faster to escalate a crisis from a nap than to risk missing a call where a key supplier might say no. When the plant finally turned a profit, we did not hold a ribbon-cutting party. We sat in the conference room and drank terrible coffee and read through the latest efficiency reports with the kind of quiet joy you get when something you built refuses to die. Eleanor tapped the report and said, "There will be days you lose little battles. Don't let them make you leave the field." I wrote that line in the margins of my notebook. I still have the page. If loyalty is a debt, then the cost can be steep. My mother got sick the year I accepted a promotion that moved me overseas. I told myself I would fly back every other weekend, but airplane tickets conspire with disease. I missed the small rituals that become anchors. Her breakfast toast burned once while she sat and waited, a phone call that connected on a bad line. I watched her photos from 1,000 miles away and told myself I'd make it up to her later. Later came, and with it an ICU room I entered with a briefcase in one hand and a bouquet in the other. Eleanor's note, a short typed instruction that said only "go," left my travel plans in a drawer. I left contracts unsigned on a desk, and the world continued. After my mother died, I learned a particular kind of silence. Grief has a geometry. It makes everything smaller and larger at once. At the funeral, a colleague from Ashford who had known my mother for years hugged me and said, "You did what you could." Those words felt both true and empty. I had been present on paper and absent in the small moments. I had negotiated for the company the way one negotiates for survival. The ledger of sacrifices was updated in a private column. Eleanor watched me in those years the way a gardener watches a slow-growing tree. She did not give advice often. She allowed me to fail and to find my footing. There was a kind of apprenticeship there that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with trust. On my last birthday before she became ill, Eleanor pressed a fountain pen into my hand. It was heavier than it looked, a simple design of brushed metal with her initials stamped at the clip. "You will need a pen that remembers," she said. "When you sign for people, you should know whose faces are on the other side." I kept that pen like a private talisman. I signed bonuses and contracts and the occasional letter of apology with it. It warmed to the shape of my fingers. It was an anchor. 3 days before Hazel Winters stood across from me with that brittle smile, I stood in a hospital corridor, watching as machines counted breaths and time. Eleanor's breaths were shorter. The room smelled of antiseptic and old paper. A nurse passed me a sealed portfolio, the kind with a ribbon you only see in movies, and an envelope marked for immediate delivery should the worst happen. I felt the weight of it like a physical thing. "Charlotte," Eleanor said, her voice a wire of something fierce, "there are things I cannot say once I'm gone. You must know that I do not think you are ready for the seat automatically. I think you are the right person for the job if you can bear the weight. I think you will choose well." She reached for something on the bedside table. It was the fountain pen. She held my hand with it as if anchoring herself to me. "Let Hazel think she's won," she said, eyes cutting toward a hairline smile. "Let everyone expose exactly who they are when they believe you're powerless. Patience and timing win more battles than force. Those were not theatrical words. They were a strategy. She had set the board up for succession, yes, but she had also engineered a set of contingencies. That sealed portfolio contained not only a video where she explained in a voice that trembled with age and authority what she wanted next, but also stock transfer documents. She had arranged for a transfer of 44% of Ashford stock to me. I already held 7%. Together, that gave me a simple majority, 51%. It was a numeric fact that still felt unreal when the nurse explained it in hushed, precise tones. Processing takes a few days, the nurse told me. We file with the SEC. There is a notice period. She used neutral phrases, and I folded them up in my head like a map of steps I would have to take. Eleanor had not made me CEO in that hospital bed. She had made me the owner who could, if given time and the right conditions, assert control through legal and corporate channels. Eleanor knew what she was doing. She had spent a lifetime thinking beyond quarterly statements. She left me the video. In it, she looked straight at the camera with that same steady gaze that had held the room. "When this goes public," she said, "do not rush. Let Hazel and the board show their true colors. They will. Let them believe they have unmade you. Let them choose themselves." I watched that message twice in the fluorescent light of the hospital room and tried to memorize the way her shoulders dipped and the exact way she said my name. I tucked the portfolio under my arm like contraband and slid the pen into my pocket with a care bordering on superstition. The tulips were a late detail. Eleanor's nurse had taken them into the room because she knew I liked them, or perhaps because red looked particularly alive against the pale hospital linen. They lay in a vase by the window, stubborn as a thing that refuses to obey prognosis. That night, I left the hospital with the portfolio in the passenger seat and a bouquet that smelled of something fierce and ordinary. I put the flowers carefully into the back of my car and told myself I would not tell anyone. It felt too close to betrayal to say aloud that the game had changed, and Eleanor had made the rules clear. Wait. Let them reveal themselves. When I stepped back through the glass into the building the next Monday, the house smelled the same. Lemon cleaner, the faint ghost of printed ink. The same plants glowed quietly in the lobby. It felt, for a moment, like an ordinary morning. I kept one hand inside my jacket on the pen. It was a poor talisman for the power that was waiting in paper and filing deadlines, but it connected me to an earlier version of myself who had learned to wait and to watch. Hazel had arrived with the kind of entourage that makes a small palace of a weekly briefing room. She moved across the floor with the certainty of a person who thinks the story has only just begun. Her plan was surgical. She announced immediate reorganizations that would consolidate her allies and isolate those she called legacy leadership. She used the phrase with a smirk, as if it were a diagnosis. They had rehearsed the moment of my dismissal like a scene in a play. Marcus Webb, who had a history of hedging his bets, shrugged as if to say he had been caught between tides and chose the one with the highest wind. "It's the market," he said later when I confronted him in the hallway. "We need fresh capital. You need to show the shareholders you can pivot," Hazel corrected, fast and soft. Pivot had the corporate ring of truth that covers a multitude of sins. I remember the tactile absurdity of packing a life into boxes. You would think after 23 years there would be fewer things. There are always more. Photographs of teams, model prototypes for products that never made it past the prototype stage, the faded program from a holiday party where my mother had once sat and laughed at a joke someone told about margins. I wrapped my pen in tissue paper and tucked it into a pocket of a blazer. It felt ridiculous and necessary. People kept their distance. Some pretended not to see. Some came too close and whispered relief, like survivors exchanging currency. Maya hovered on the edge of the crowd and passed me a file with her thumb covering the title, "For when you need it." I wanted to fold her into my arms and say thank you. Instead, I accepted the file and the weight of another person's loyalty. There was a minute, perhaps more, that I stood by the kitchen area and watched the office continue. The coffee machine hissed and someone microwaved fish. The glass walls were transparent and hypocritical. They promised openness, but kept secrets in sight. Outside, delivery trucks rolled past, as they always had. Life in the building was a long loop. People come and people go. But in those loops, the individual lives of people we count on can be recalibrated by a single crossover moment. I did not shout. I did not make a scene. I have always thought of fury as a currency to spend carefully.
And Eleanor's voice, recorded and flat on the hospital video, kept replaying in my head. Let them think they've won. Let everyone expose exactly who they are when they believe you're powerless. So I did nothing. That silence was not surrender. It felt like a contract I had made in a gray hospital room. I watched Hazel for the rest of the day. She set meetings and sent directives in the tone of someone who believes erasure of the past is a path to culturing loyalty. She began an email chain about right-sizing that had the smell of inevitability. People I had hired, people I had mentored, received notices in pale text. A department I had fought to protect was flagged for immediate restructuring. I watched cheeks go pale and the way supervisors tried to offer confidence with a voice that cracked. At home that night, I opened the portfolio again. The documents were clear and sober. Stock certificates, signatures, a sanctuary of legal language that translated into a simple number, 44%. The SEC filing, explained in plain terms by the attorney included in the portfolio, would begin processing as soon as we submitted the transfer. Eleanor's instruction was precise. She had timed the processes so that the filing would show as effective 3 days after her death. The public notice would process with whatever administrative slowness the regulators had, and when the notice appeared, it would be public record. The point was not to rely on bureaucratic immediacy, but to rely on the public clarity of ownership. I thought of the number again and again, 44%, and the weight it implied. 44% is not an amount that allows you to shout from the front. It's a careful placement of a stake. My 7% added to it made a majority. 51% is a simple geometry of control. But control is a legal and relational thing. It does not immediately reorder allegiances or erase the power that momentum and influence buy you. The board doesn't fall in line because a certificate arrives. It votes. The SEC doesn't move its pen because you want it to. It records. Eleanor had left me the architecture of power. She had not left me the theatrics of victory. There would be no dramatic overthrow the moment the papers posted. There would be votes and challenges, and likely a few board members who would claim to be blindsided. I took comfort in the clarity. The rules were written, visible, predictable. We could play by them. I kept the portfolio in my apartment for 3 days. I told no one, which felt like lying by omission to people I loved and had pledged to protect.
I called Patricia Chin and told her, in an oblique way, that I had concerns about the direction Hazel was taking. Patricia's response was a soft one. Be careful. She had been with Ashford long enough to understand both loyalties and the tedium of survival in a changing board. She promised to listen. When the actual firing happened, I had the hospital memory folded into me like a spare jacket you take for flight. It warmed me. It was not a solution. It was a rationale for patience. Watching Hazel perform triumph in front of the staff felt like watching someone close a chapter without reading it. I could have offered my hand to the person who replaced me. Instead, I stood, looked at the room, and thought of the people whose lives were tied to the company beyond the quarterly return. That night, after people's condolences and the canned words of corporate HR had run their course, Maya and I sat in my small kitchen with the lights low. The tulips were wilted, but still red. They looked like small flags. You should tell someone, Maya said, voice a small, taut thing. I'm not telling anyone, I replied. Not yet. She studied my face like someone reading instructions. How long? Until the filing is public, I said. I understood how little that answered her question. The filing would be public on Friday, the attorney's note said. A small bureaucratic certainty in a world of social performatives. That left me a several-day corridor between being cast out and being able to act. I could have called the board. I could have marched straight back in and demanded a hearing. But Eleanor had not built a contingency plan just to be dramatic. She had expected me to be strategic. You're going to wait, Maya said, a little defiant. You're really going to sit and let them do whatever they want for 3 days? Yes, I said. The word felt like a stone thrown into a long pond. Ripples would come. People would be hurt. The calculus of waiting has a moral friction. By delaying action, you allow harm to unfold. But by acting too swiftly, you risk letting the hurt be amplified by chaos. That was the exact kind of paradox Eleanor had taught me to hold. I thought of my mother's burnt toast and the missed phone calls. I thought of the man on the loading dock in Seattle who had once told me he trusted me because I had shown up.
Those memories were not tidy. They were a messy collage of reasons why staying was a form of fidelity. So I waited, but waiting was not the same as doing nothing. I cleaned out my desk with the kind of methodical focus people use when grief is newly raw. I wrapped awards and notes in tissue paper and counted the pens I had accumulated over the years like an inventory of small loyalties. I copied everything of consequence, a reflex I'd learned from Eleanor when systems are fragile. I wrote a list of people who should be called if decisions turned wrong: Patricia, Daniel Reeves, Marcus.
I scribbled down names in a notebook and underlined them. On the third night, I parked across from the building and watched the lighted windows. Hazel was inside somewhere, no doubt drafting an email that would thin out departments and lift new voices. I held the fountain pen in the dark like a prayer before a face. The pen's metal glinted where a streetlight touched it. I thought of Eleanor's taped instruction: let them reveal themselves. The building breathed the same way as ever, and yet everything was different. There is a kind of cruelty in waiting. You witness the initial acts of someone who believes they've rewritten the rules. The cruelty is not so much in what they do, but in how casually they assume the forward motion of their decisions will be accepted. I knew Hazel's type. She wanted a clean slate, even if it cost livelihoods. She was efficient and talented and ruthless, a combination that can look like genius from the right distance. I admit now there were times in those 3 days I wanted to run. I wanted to go to a hotel in a different city, hear someone else's elevator hum, and not be defined by the building with the glass walls I could now see through. But there was also a stubborn strand of duty in me that wouldn't let me do that. The pen in my pocket felt like the hinge on which a decision might swing, and the portfolio under my bed felt like a sleeping thing that could wake at the right second. When the emails started to circulate about the new efficiencies, I read them not as declarations but as evidence. They revealed assumptions: that people would leave quietly, that those who had offered loyalty for decades would accept the knife with silence. They misread my colleagues because they did not understand the thing that holds a company together: the human stuff. Pride, fear, habit. The networks of obligations that do not appear on a balance sheet, but cost more when broken. Maya called that night and left me a voice message that trembled slightly. "You need to eat," she said, the way friends say small practicalities to each other, like bread thrown across a chasm. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sat with the pen and the portfolio and rehearsed the steps I would take when the filing posted. There were legal thresholds, board votes, and procedural things that would not bend to desire. This is where my training showed up. Not in theatrics, but in knowing the sequence of actions that would be necessary for the board to recognize a change in control. The decision to wait was for me a moral choice, every bit as much as a strategic one. There is a moral calculus in leadership many people forget. Do you protect the institution at the cost of people, or do you risk institutional harm to save people? Eleanor had given me the tools to choose both, if possible. She had also given me the permission to choose wrong, as long as I chose deliberately. On the fourth day, I walked into the office with a cardboard box and a face that didn't want to betray what it held. People looked at me with a new kind of attention now that the rumor had settled into belief. The long-time executive who had been pushed out. I kept my voice small and my steps measured. When you are played, it is easy to believe the narrative the actors on stage want you to believe. Self-preservation often feels like stepping into that narrative. But the portfolio under my couch, labeled with a red ribbon and the weight of Eleanor's last years, made the narrative pliant. It was the secret that could alter the geometry of power. It did not feel like retribution. It felt like a statement about what leadership could be if built on patience and moral clarity. That night, I sat with the tulips, which had been miserable in their box since being carried to the building that first morning. They had dried at the edges but kept their color. I placed them in a glass and set them on the windowsill, where the city would rub against them in the dark. I held the pen and thought about the signature, what it could repair and what it would demand of me. I thought of Eleanor's voice again, thin and unwavering. Let them reveal exactly who they are. There is a weird intimacy to being dismissed in public. It teaches you humility and also shows you the faces of people as they stand before power. Some of them looked away because they feared for their jobs. Some of them watched me with a mixture of pity and calculation.
One mid-level manager, someone I had championed for promotion, touched my arm and said, "You deserve better." It was the sincerest lie I would receive all week. I went home that night to the small apartment where the portfolio lived under a bed, and I lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling. I let myself think uncharitable thoughts about Hazel. She was tactically brilliant in the way that meant she could read a moment and harvest it. She was also arrogant enough to assume the tide would always favor her. People like her forget that numbers and votes, while predictable in a way, require witnesses. Those witnesses will sometimes, if pushed past a line, stand for something other than survival. In the cold hours before dawn, I read the documents again. The stock transfer was not a gift. It was a plan. Eleanor had, in the quiet business of someone who had built and governed a company for decades, chosen the instrument of change most effective for a slow, public moment, a transfer process through the SEC that would show as a public filing. It was elegant because it was boring. Bureaucracy, in the end, can be a tool for justice if you understand how to use it. I put the pen into my blazer and folded the documents back into their folder.
I made a list of names to call if I had to litigate. I wrote in the margins of the legal instructions columns of simple actions to verify once the filing posted, confirm the transfer effective date, notify the corporate secretary, arrange a meeting with Patricia and Daniel. The plan was not spectacular. It was a list. The morning after my dismissal, I walked into the boardroom not to plead, but to observe. Hazel was there, arranging her colleagues like chess pieces with a calm that made my skin prickle. She spoke about momentum and the need for a sharper edge. Her rhetoric was airtight. There was no cruelty in her phrases. She had the discipline of someone who believes their own acts are necessary sacrifices. "Pack your desk," she had said. Later that same week, she would use phrases like strategic divestiture and streamlining our talent. She would couch layoffs in terms that sounded like medicine. Strategy can be a kind of hygiene, yet hygiene sometimes masks extraction. I closed the distance between the boardroom and myself like an invisible seamstress. I listened. I cataloged. I looked for who would speak next, who would stand with Hazel, and who would shift when the first public filing came across their screens. There are small tells you learn in corporate life. The pause before a comment. The way someone's eyes go to the chair at the head of the table. People who will betray you often do so when they believe the tide has turned. Listening did not mean inaction. It meant gathering knowledge, packing small truths into the folder I carried not as proof yet, but as options. Eleanor had taught me to make sure options are prepared before they're needed. So I prepared. When the day closed and the building seemed to breathe again in a smaller, darker way, I stepped outside and saw, across the street, someone leaving an unlocked bicycle by the curb. It was a small, banal detail, but in that moment it felt like the world had not ended. The tulips on my windowsill had opened a little more in the night air. The pen in my blazer went cool against my ribs. I made myself a promise then. Not dramatic or grandiose, but honest. I would follow Eleanor's instruction. I would let Hazel think she had won. I would let everyone reveal who they were when they believed I was powerless. I would wait. Patience, I had learned, is also an active muscle. It needs to be used, exercised, and strengthened. It is not the same as quiet surrender. It is a choice to hold back until the sequence you control lines up with the moment the public record makes the facts undeniable. 3 days to Friday. 3 days for a filing to work its way into the public eye. 3 days for people to show their hands. I drove home that night with the pen against my sternum, tulips safe in the back seat, and the portfolio lying under the passenger seat like a sleeping animal. The wind lifted the papers a little as the car slowed at a red light. A man on the sidewalk paused to help a child with a loose shoe. A dog barked. The city breathed on. There is a kind of clarity when you hold a secret that can change everything. It is both intoxicating and terrifying. It is also lonely. The drive was a corridor of reflections, the faces of those who had stood for me, the ones who had bowed to the new order, and Eleanor's small, inexorable voice reminding me of timing. The pen in my pocket felt like a metronome. I tucked my hands into it and let the rhythm keep me company. I did not yet know how many would be hurt by the delay. I did not yet know whether the board would bend under the weight of public record, or whether Hazel would scramble away to entrench herself beyond certificates and votes. What I did know was that the rules were in ink and paper now, not in rumor and charisma. I closed my eyes for a moment at a light and saw my mother's smile, the foreman on the Seattle dock, Eleanor's thin hand on mine.
I thought of all the things people say about loyalty being its own reward. Sometimes loyalty's reward is responsibility. Sometimes it is waking early to make difficult decisions. I inhaled the scent of the tulips, the faint hospital antiseptic still in their petals, as if the plant itself had held memory, and I drove on. The week stretched ahead of me like a map with lines that could be followed. For now, the endgame lived in a folder, in the tiny, precise shapes of signatures, and in a public filing that would speak in bureaucratic language about transfer dates and percentages. It would be dull, but for once, dullness favored the just. I parked across the street from Ashford again on Thursday night, watching the lit windows like low stars. The building was an animal that slept most of the day and hummed at night. I sat in my car with the engine off and let the pen press a little against my chest, feeling the metal and the ache beneath it. Somewhere in the darkness, a siren wailed, and the city rearranged itself into its night rhythm. I thought about the morning that would come, and the simple public note that would change everything. If the filing posted on Friday morning as Eleanor had arranged, those who had celebrated my dismissal would find their congratulations complicated by facts. By the time I climbed the stairs to my apartment, my hands had begun to steady. I took the portfolio out and smoothed the edges. The documents were not a weapon. They were a set of instructions. Eleanor's handwriting marked the final page. When this is done, you must choose. You can take the company and keep it as it was, or you can change it into the thing you wish it to be. I folded the page back into the envelope and tucked it under the pen, as if the two objects wanted to be together. Outside, a bus passed and scattered the smell of diesel into the night. Inside my apartment, the tulips leaned toward the window, stubborn and red against the dark. I do not tell the story to boast.
I tell it because there is a long tail of choices that most people never see. I tell it because sometimes being on the losing side for a moment is not failure. It is a place to watch how the world orders itself when you are thought to be gone. There is a lesson in watching. Friday morning would come. The filing would post. People would look at their devices and see a line of text in a public registry that would not lie. That small bureaucratic truth would be the lever. But levers do nothing without hands to pull them and witnesses to see them pulled. The rest would be politics and votes and the slow, sometimes ugly business of turning law into action. For now, I had a fountain pen, a bouquet in a glass, and a folder with Eleanor's last arrangements. I had a list of names and one stubborn promise. I had watched people reveal the kinds of choices they make when power becomes immediate. Some kind, some cruel, most cautious. I had felt humiliation and the strange serenity of an old, patient plan finally starting to tick. I folded the tulip stems a little, straightened the pen under the portfolio, and sat down to write an email to Patricia. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The subject line felt too small for what the message contained. Then I wrote, "If you're able, can we meet today? There are things I'd rather not say over an email." I hit send and sat back. The pen against my heart was cool and sure. Outside, the city did not know what would happen. Inside, my mind looped back to Eleanor's last words like a mantra. Patience and timing win more battles than force. Let them reveal themselves. If you believe loyalty deserves more than dismissal, stay with me. The story was only waking up. Patricia arrived early, which was like a small mercy. She sat across from me at a window table in a cafe 2 blocks from Ashford, and for the first time in days I could look at her without feeling like someone watching my hands for the wrong tremor. She ordered black coffee and folded her fingers around the cup the way someone holds a lifeline. "You look like hell," she said, not unkindly, and like someone who hasn't slept. "I haven't," I admitted. "I haven't eaten well either." She leaned forward. "So, what is the play?" I laid the portfolio on the table between us and watched Patricia's eyes move across the documents as if they were maps she knew how to read. She touched the edge of the certificate with a finger that had steadied countless board signatures in her time. 44%, she said finally, voice low. "And your 7 gives you..." 51, I finished. I hadn't wanted to say the number aloud for a long time. Numbers were simple and terrible. They carried no compassion. But it's not a theatrical majority. It's control with caveats. The transfer posts to the SEC on Friday. The point is to wait until it's public. Patricia nodded. Straightforward. The majority is the lever, but you still need witnesses and votes.
The law gives you leverage at the shareholder level. Day to day, the board is where decisions get made. People will need to make a choice. Some will follow the peeper. Some will follow fear. Her eyes were kind in a way that held no surprise.
She had been the kind of board member who watched the room for more than 20 years and had learned where courage sometimes hides. "Who's in your camp?" I named them. Daniel Reeves, who ran operations with a devotion that made the word count look sentimental. Marcus Webb, whose public face concealed a practical streak. Patricia herself, who had always been subtle. Sarah Kimball, who worried aloud but had integrity. Robert Pierce, a lawyer on retainer who had once argued loopholes into submission. I left out those who I suspected would side with Hazel. Convenience is a powerful motivator. Patricia folded her napkin with a small mechanical motion. "We'll need the counsel on standby," she said, "and proof. Paper alone will get you far, but if Hazel can muddy the waters with counterclaims of impropriety or argue the transfer is disputed, votes can wobble. Do you have anything that shows intent?" I thought of the audio file tucked into Maya's secure drive. I thought of an email thread where Hazel's language had slipped. Cleanse, streamline, remove friction. Words that look sterile until you see the people attached to them. I had hesitated over the audio. It felt invasive at first. But when Maya had told me, with a voice that shook in a different way than mine, that she had a recording from a leadership call where Hazel had spoken plainly about making way for her people, the moral calculus shifted. Hazel's statements were not private confession. They were strategic direction in which the board and HR were implicated. "There's an audio," I said. "Not illegal surveillance. It comes from a recorded leadership session for which we keep transcripts and audio for minutes." Maya flagged it because Hazel was explicit. "It's about pressing the advantage and mentions specific targets. I think it will make clear this isn't a case of tough decisions. It's a planned purge." Patricia's mouth narrowed. "Good. We'll have legal authenticate it. We need to show intent, not innuendo. We'll verify the timestamps of the meeting roster. If Hazel has drafted memos that match the audio, that will be stronger." "And the video?" I asked. "Eleanor's message?" "That's the hinge," Patricia said. "It shows intent in reverse. A patron giving instruction for a specific posture. It will read as deliberate planning. We can't overplay it, but we can use it to frame the timing and the intent." We both sat for a moment listening to the city move around us. Beyond the blast, a courier hopped off a bike with a package. 2 women argued about a dress in the window of a boutique. Nothing in the city hinted at how bureaucratic truth can topple a week's worth of polished rhetoric. "I'll call Daniel," Patricia said.
Marcus is the tricky one. Her voice softened. He hedges to survive. He will choose a tide that seems to favor him. We have to make sure the tide looks like policy and clarity. I told her about the Friday filing, the precise language the attorney had used in the portfolio I kept like something dangerous. Patricia made the arrangement calls, discreet, the way seasoned professionals do when a wrong word can become a headline. Daniel answered on the second ring. He sounded like someone who had slept standing up. "When do you need me?" he asked. "When the filing posts. Be ready for a call. If you can, have ops people quiet until we set the tempo." Daniel's voice steadied, and there was an economy of breath that told me he would be there. When I left the cafe, I felt a small, physical unburdening. Conspiracy is a kind of intimacy. It is quieter than grief, but it demands more steadiness. I walked to the office and almost expected to find the mahogany table waiting, like an altar. Instead, the reception hummed in its usual way. Security cameras blinked from corners, as if nothing at all had been happening. On Thursday night, Maya texted me with the file I had not dared open since she slid it into my hand the first afternoon. Listening to Hazel on the recording was like watching a strategy with its mask off. She spoke about accelerating attrition and letting the messy legacies go, words that sounded like product specs until you thought of the faces attached, the plant managers, the engineers, the people who timed their mortgages to payroll cycles. She mentioned 2 managers by name and laughed, a short, clean sound, when she said they would be grateful for the merciful lie of a buyout. The clip ended with her saying, almost conversationally, "No one will miss them the way we will. That's the point." Maya had highlighted the timestamps and had included an export that showed who was on the line. She had scrubbed the file and backed it to 3 drives. When she dropped the link into my inbox, she added, "I saved copies off-site. I printed the notes. If anything happens, the files are with my sister. She knows where to send them." Maya is the kind of person who organizes for the long view, even when the immediate view looks like a cliff. She had always been that way, the small, meticulous scaffolding to my larger plans. Her voice when she called was dry, all business. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I am," I said. "I'm trying to be."
Friday morning came the way bureaucracy does, ordinary and unavoidable. I walked into the building with a folder under my arm and the pen in my pocket. My hands did not tremble. They felt steady with the thin, keen edge of the moment. The tulips in a glass on my kitchen sill had drooped further, but the color remained, like old loyalties that won't stop being themselves. It was nearly 9 when my phone began to ping.
Little chimes. Someone retweeted a piece about market strategy, a calendar reminder, a text from a cousin asking about a recipe. I ignored them all until my device flashed a corporate notification. Corporate Secretary, Notice of Ownership Filing. It arrived like a small bureaucratic bomb. Maya had coordinated it, a mass notice from the secretary's office with a link to a public SEC notice. I had instructed her to trigger it at the moment the filing posted, but seeing it reach everyone else's screens at once was like a line in a score where the orchestra hits a chord. In conference rooms across the floor, people looked up. Hazel paused mid-slide in the briefing she was giving. Her face didn't change at first. She was the kind of actor who learned to make panic invisible. There was a ripple of murmurs. Phones lit up. People who had cheered the week before now scrolled, frowns unspooling across their features. On the desk nearest to me, Marcus froze. He had his eyes on his tablet, as if seeing a crossword clue he hadn't expected. Maya moved like a small, efficient shadow. She came to the front of the room and tapped the projection panel. The SEC cage loaded for everyone. The filing was dully precise. Transfer effective date, percentages, signatures. It was language of an administration box, dry, uncompromising. There was the line everyone would read and not want to see. Transfer of 44% to Charlotte Brennan. Effective date, 3 days after Eleanor Ashford's death. Hazel's slide deck dimmed. She smiled as if the problem could be smiled through. Her voice, when she spoke again, had the practiced calm of someone who understands narrative control. "This is a clerical notice," she said. "We will verify. Until then, there's nothing to—" Patricia spoke before I could. "The filing is valid on its face," she said. "We can verify authentication through the firm Eleanor used. If there's any question about the authenticity of the signature, we can call counsel. But the public record is the lever here." She did not look at Hazel when she said it. She looked at the room as if asking who would stand with whom. Hazel's jaw ticked. "You will check and come back," she said, tone clipped. "This is diversionary. We should stay on message, on momentum." Then Maya did something I hadn't planned but was grateful for. She stood and played Eleanor's video on the conference screen. Eleanor's hair was thinner, her voice a wire of fatigue wrapped in steel. She spoke to me, with an old resolve. "Let Hazel think she's won," she said. "Let them expose themselves when they believe you're powerless." I felt a softness at the base of my skull where the pen rested like a secret. The room was quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. Then, one after another, devices chimed as board members opened the SEC notice and the attached verification of signatures. The room smelled faintly of coffee and something electric. I stepped forward with the portfolio and placed it on the mahogany table. The wood glinted under my palm. The pen in my pocket warmed to my side, as if remembering where it belonged. Hazel's lips tightened. "What is this?" she asked. "Evidence," I said. "A transfer processed through normal channels. If you want to dispute it on technical grounds, we'll have counsel on the line. But right now, this is public record." "Public record doesn't remove boards," Hazel said. "It doesn't instantly change governance." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't. But public record gives shareholders the legal ability to instruct the board. It changes the political calculation, and it adds the possibility of litigation if misstatements are made." My voice was calm. I felt the old apprenticeship in me, Eleanor's lessons in choosing fights. Patricia slid an envelope across the table toward me and opened it. Inside were certified copies of the transfer and a letter from Eleanor's lawyer confirming the timeline. Daniel sat up straighter, Marcus's hands folded in front of him with a clarity that made his previous hedging look expensive. Hazel stood up then, like someone who had rehearsed an exit but found the doors closed. "This is a stunt," she said. "You had access to privileged processes." "You had access to privileged processes," I replied quietly. "But the processes have rules. They are public." There was an odd moment of silence then, that metallic, electric pause where facts accumulate weight. Robert Pierce, ordinarily the face of legal hedging, cleared his throat. "We need to vote to determine confidence," he said. "We need to follow bylaws. We need to be careful of precedent." Patricia nodded. "Correct. We also need to be honest with shareholders. If the public record's a transfer, and we proceed as if it did not exist, we create a conflict of interest that will be messy, costly, and visible. Board members must choose between protecting their own positions or protecting the company from the kind of leadership that has—" She didn't finish. The look on her face said enough. A murmur went through the room. Hazel's composure cracked in a small way. Her hands flexed at her sides. A finger tapped a rhythm against the table. "You're bluffing," she said. "You have no legal standing until the shareholders vote." "Patience and timing win more battles than force," I said softly, hearing Eleanor's voice as if it had been waiting to be spoken. "This is not a bluff. This is a public filing that changed the legal geometry of control. We are not asking for an immediate overhaul of governance. We're asking for the board to acknowledge the facts and to vote on confidence in the current leadership." Marcus looked at me with that banker's half-smile that meant thought. Votes, he said. Votes are how these things are decided. Patricia moved through the room like a conductor.
She called for an emergency board meeting, invoking a clause in the bylaws that allowed the board to convene to discuss material changes in ownership. It was procedural, boring, exactly what we needed. The board retreated into a side room to agree on the process. Hazel followed, every step a practiced defiance. Outside the inner room, the floor seemed to slow. People watched, but there was a different cadence now, curiosity more than fear. Something about seeing public notice shifted a few faces from panic to calculation. In operations, Daniel had already been making calls, securing payroll, putting contingency plans into action for the people's sake, rather than for corporate theater. His steadying hand had a liquidity to it that made panic recede. When the board reconvened, the vote was called. The process required a motion of no confidence to be put forward, and a simple majority of those present to pass. I had understood the risk. Not all board members would act. Some would claim procedural hesitation, and Hazel had allies. But the public record had done work for us. It made choosing sides visible. Marcus held the room longer than anyone. He was the loner who measured storms by their barometric pressure, and had hedged because he feared being wrong more than he feared being cruel. He looked at Hazel with an unlit warmth, and then at me. The seconds stretched. I thought of the loading dock in Seattle, of a foreman with a face like open weather, telling me that people needed someone to show up. I thought of my mother, only one small voice that made my life decisions heavier than board minutes. "Mr. Webb," Patricia prompted gently. Marcus's voice was quiet but certain. "We need to be honest with shareholders. If we do nothing, we risk being sued, and we risk losing faith. If we accept denial in the face of public record, we become liabilities. I vote no confidence in current management." There was a small sound like a page turning in the room. One by one, memes followed. Some votes were slow, grudging. Others were swift. People who had hesitated found their courage in the clarity of the public filing. The result was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The motion passed. Hazel stood with a look of something like betrayal, and then a composure that was well practiced. "This is politics," she said. "You should be careful what you ask for." "You're right," Patricia said. "But it's also governance. We have to choose who will lead the company through this moment with moral clarity." There was an ambulance wailing somewhere outside the building. The sound floated in and away like a distant exhale. Hazel turned to me then, as if the final act of a long play required a closing line. Her voice was small. "You don't want it," she said. "You would be consumed." "I know what it will take," I said. "I know what my mother lost. I know the salary numbers and the human stories."
I also know you can build with extraction, or you can build with stewardship. I want the latter. Hazel's expression hardened into something I recognized, the professional will to do harm in the name of progress. "We can work out a less humiliating exit for both of us," she said. "Resign quietly, and we will keep the transition civil." It was a gesture. It was also an experiment in compulsion. Offer mercy to see whether I've the grace to accept the easy path. Mercy feels different when it's offered by someone who benefits from your absence. "You can resign," I said, "or the board can remove you. The choice is yours." My voice did not rise. It held the pen in my pocket like an anchor. Hazel glared at the room the way someone might stare down a mirror that denies the image they prefer. Then she laughed, a single sharp sound, and reached into her bag. She pulled out a folder as if to throw down a gauntlet. "You think the public notice is the same as power," she said. "Power is about momentum. It's about making hard choices." "I know hard choices," I said, "but hard doesn't need to mean cruel. We can choose to rebuild without seeing people as dispensable." She flicked the folder shut with a clipped hand. "You would keep the people who weigh us down." "I would keep the people who show up," I said, "and I would protect those who cannot fight for themselves. That's not kindness for kindness's sake. It's durable leadership." There was an odd pause after that, like a place where a fault line found new rock. Hazel's face softened in a way that made me feel a small, private sorrow for the person who had made herself lithe enough to thrive on breaking things. "You don't get to be sentimental and powerful," she said, not a question. "Sentimental and steady," I corrected. "Maybe that's my brand of power." When Hazel left the room that afternoon, she left with a dignity that held its own cruelty. She had chosen to keep her resume intact,
to make a clean exit on her terms rather than extend a public, messy friction. She handed in a resignation letter that read like a professional eulogy. It was filed in the corporate record, and she left with an air of someone who had been outplayed, but who still believed, perhaps in the myths she had told herself, that she could rebuild somewhere else. I took the seat at the head of the table as the board looked to me with a kind of adult hope, weary, suspicious, and willing to try again. Robert slid a corporate resolution my way and asked me to sign an interim onboarding as acting CEO, pending a formal shareholder ratification that would be scheduled. It was the kind of step that felt ceremonial and binding at once. I took out the fountain pen, Eleanor's pen, and felt the small metallic weight where it had lived against my rib. The click of the cap sounded in the room like a metronome setting a new tempo. I signed the resolution slowly, the pen gliding over the paper. Its nib left a thin, emphatic line.
When I set it down, the room exhaled in a way that wasn't quite applause, but something like it. My first act as acting CEO was a small, concrete thing. I reversed the immediate right-sizing notices that had gone out earlier in the week. Human Resources had drafted them in the language of a surgical excision. I told Daniel to pull them back and to construct a different program, one that offered retraining, redeployment, and, where unavoidable, generous severance and assistance in finding new roles. The room tilted in response. Relief, skepticism, gratitude. It was not dramatic. It was steady. I called a town hall for that afternoon. I wanted everyone to hear from me directly. When I stood before the staff in the Great Hall, the same one where I had been dismissed 3 days before, the tulips felt absurdly present in my mind. I thought of Eleanor's pen, of my mother's burnt toast. I thought of the foreman in Seattle and the small economies that keep families moving through a week. I know what today feels like, I began. I know that for some of you this week has meant fear. For others it has meant a resignation that your work and loyalty can be erased on a slide. I want to be clear about something. This company exists because of you, not because of me, not because of any single executive. You are the company. People listened. There were faces I had known for decades. There were new faces I had yet to learn how to hold in my heart. Some cried. A plant supervisor stood up and thanked me for not throwing people away. His voice was raw and small, and made the room tilt toward what felt like a better story. I told them plainly about the decision to reverse the immediate notices and to craft a new plan built on investment rather than extraction. I spoke of new programs, a pledge to commit resources to retraining, to protect defined benefit programs for those approaching retirement, to audit vendor contracts for ethical compliance, to create a worker representation forum to the board. It wasn't perfect. It didn't save every position, but it offered a different calculus. People clapped in small, uneven bursts. Some of them wiped their faces. After the town hall, staff clustered in knots and then dissolved into their tasks like dust settling. Daniel came up to me with a tired smile and a thermos of coffee he insisted I take. "You did a good thing," he said. "Maybe a selfish thing, too, but a company is nothing without people." "Maybe selfish and good," I agreed, "but isn't that what leadership should be?" That night, after the building had emptied and the lights had dimmed to those soft office lamps that make the world look like a bruised star, I sat at my desk with Eleanor's envelope in front of me. It had been sealed with a thin strip of tape that still held a faint scent of the hospital's antiseptic to it. Patricia had insisted I not open it until the immediate crisis passed. Now, with the flank contained and the staff murmurs less panicked, I felt the weight of it like a hand. Inside was a letter in Eleanor's tidy hand. Her handwriting had the practiced slant of someone who had written many firm directives in her life. She wrote simply, "You now have the option. Keep Ashford large and efficient, or change it into something that does not consume the people who make it. Both are hard. Both will require sacrifice. Choose as you will. I trust you." Beneath that was a small card with a line she had circled. "Patience and timing win more battles than force." I read the letter twice, then 3 times. It felt like permission. It felt like a grant. It felt like a charge. There is a kind of solitude in power that people rarely discuss. The seat at the head of a table can be a lonely place because the decisions you make there have a human weight. They are not metaphors. They are mortgages and lunches and the small dignity of a paycheck. I thought of my mother and the breakfasts I missed. I thought of the way Eleanor had pressed the pen into my hand like a relic and said you'd need one that remembers.
I understood then that the pen was not a weapon, but a reminder. Signatures make promises. Promises make consequences. The next weeks were a blur of meetings that demanded the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a gardener. They were hearings with counsel and a shareholder meeting planned for a later date where the transfer would be legally ratified. I walked the floor more than I sat in my office. I met with teams in the break rooms, in plant floors, in small offices with windows that let in the smell of the shipping dock. People told me their stories. A single mother worried about childcare, a machinist who had been at Ashford for 30 years, a young engineer who had stayed through 3 acquisitions because she believed in the work. Their voices were more consequential than any quarterly forecast. The board asked for a policy overhaul process to be set in motion. We formed a committee that included Patricia, Daniel, an HR lead, and 2 elected staff representatives. It was a clumsy, imperfect structure, but it allowed human stories to be part of the table. I insisted that any future reorganizations be preceded by a human impact assessment and a mitigation plan. We will not make people collateral for a plan, I told the group. We will not use terms like attrition to disguise what is essentially joblessness. Not everyone liked my tempo. Markets are impatient, and investors sometimes prefer clean, extractive solutions because they move numbers quickly. Some outside voices criticized the decision to hold off on immediate cost cutting. I listened to those criticisms and tried to trade them for reasons. I had learned Eleanor's lessons about timing. The question was whether humane leadership could be defended in both public relations and profit.
The short answer was that it would be messy. The long answer was that it could, if steady hands and courage held. There were evenings when I felt the old shame creep in. The file drawer that had once held my mother's final letter, the missed phone calls, the postponed lunches. Leadership required a presence I had not perfected. It required an ability to love the institution and to love the people who made it run without letting the two become indistinguishable. It required fortitude and kindness in equal measure. On a humid afternoon a month later, the shareholder ratification met expectations. The filing had posted and the public had read the small bureaucratic notice that made the geometry of ownership visible. The ratification was routine, and yet when the fold of the ceremony closed and the vote registered, the room felt as if a long, small breath had been let out. My 51% meant that while the board would continue to operate and votes would be necessary, the moral direction of the company now had a clear anchor. I had the authority to insist that corporate decisions include human costs as part of any calculus. There were people who left during the months that followed, some voluntarily, some under negotiated terms. Some friendships frayed into silence. There were board members who decided to retire and others who stayed with pragmatic promises. Hazel found a role somewhere else, and I learned she had signed a non-disparagement clause that made our public exchanges civil rather than venomous. There is a strange mercy in that. People who choose the path of cruelty often prefer the comfort of a runway away from the consequences. A small ritual cropped up in my days. I would take Eleanor's fountain pen down from my desk at the end of a long afternoon and hold it like a compass. It had the faintest abrasion where my thumb rubbed, and sometimes when I felt tired, I would roll it between my fingers as if the metal had the capacity to steady decisions. The tulips in my office survived in a green pot someone had given me. They were no longer a symbol of humiliation, but of continuity. They trembled sometimes in the drafts from the air conditioning vents, and when they did, I thought of that opening scene and how small gestures can carry meaning. I knew there would be people who would tell me to sell the company, to take the money, to vanish somewhere with the quiet solace of retirement. The offer was real. A private equity firm approached with the same bland enthusiasm for streamlined assets that Hazel had once displayed. It was a tempting clean line. Cash out, ensure retirement, avoid the long slog of rebuilding. Eleanor had written that I could choose to sell if I wished. I sat with the offer for a week. I walked the factory floor at dawn with Daniel and watched the men and women load materials into trucks, their motions practiced and true, like the moving parts of a clock. I visited the R&D lab and observed a young team bent over a prototype that had the feel of hopeful obsession. I answered emails from suppliers and customers that were not investors. They were people calling about deliveries, about children and daycare, about school fundraising. That night in my office, I opened Eleanor's envelope once more and let her words sit with me. It would have been easy to cash out, to walk away with a tidy number and a silence that felt like refuge. But something in the months since the filing had shifted me beyond the need for vindication. I had expected victory to be somehow simpler. Instead, it had become a set of responsibilities that weighed and steadied me. I put the pen to a new page and wrote a sentence that would become the seed of my first strategic memo as acting CEO.
It read, "We will be profitable and humane." It was not a slogan. It was a vow that required detail and follow-through. There were nights I sat at my mother's place, in the memory that had once been the axis for my choices, and thought of the small life she had held. I had missed toasts and breakfasts, and those failures had left me with a sharp, useful wound. The wound reminded me to show up. I thought of the foreman in Seattle, of the engineer who had stayed through acquisitions, of Maya who had sacrificed privacy to preserve evidence. There was a tapestry here, 1,000 small threads, and pulling one loose can unravel a week of paychecks. I announced a 10-year plan that balanced capital allocation to R&D and community investment. We set aside a fund for retraining and community engagement. We instituted clearer whistleblowing protections and transparency forms where employees could voice concerns directly to the board through an ombudsperson. We introduced staggered managerial transitions rather than abrupt mass terminations. None of it was radical in theory. In practice, it required retooling incentives, recalibrating bonuses, and persuading investors that stability could outlast short-term uplift. The months ahead were not easy. Markets sniffed at our choices. Some investors grumbled. Others stayed, intrigued by the endurance game. People left and people arrived. There were nights when the weight felt too heavy, when the pen lay on my desk like a burden instead of a compass. I grappled with the private cost of public office, the dinners I missed, the family moments postponed, the intimacy that erosion brings. But the things I had protected, a plant that would have been closed, a pension plan that would have been stripped, remained. Eleanor's voice came to me in small, private ways. In an email I found among her files recommending a charitable partner, in a note she had sent about a supplier who had gone unnoticed, in the weight of the fountain pen itself. One evening I found a voice memo she had recorded years earlier about a management principle. Lead from the side that sees. Be the person who notices the unnoticed.
There was a cost to staying. Romantic relationships wilted under the pressure of my calendars, and there were friendships that did not survive. The grief for my mother lingered like a soft, constant ache. I learned to carry regret without letting it define me. Leadership in this sense was less triumph than stewardship, a continuous set of small decisions held together by a persistent moral argument. At the end of my first year as acting CEO, we met our commitments and missed a few. The company did not become a miracle overnight. It became something else, steady, stubborn, morally legible. We had not eliminated the ugly edges of capitalism, but we had softened some of the sharpest cuts and created institutional friction against wanton extraction. People told stories in the cafeteria about how a plant manager had been given a chance to move into training rather than be furloughed, about how suppliers had been given fairer terms. These small stories mattered more than any headline. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, I walked through the atrium and saw a small cluster of red tulips someone had brought. They trembled in a vase near the reception desk. I felt my chest lighten in a way that surprised me. The flower's color was like a punctuation mark on a long paragraph. Maya approached with 2 cups of coffee. She offered me one without words, the way friends do when language is unnecessary. "You kept them," she said simply. "I kept most of them," I replied. She smiled. "You could have sold the company," she said, "or you could walk away. You stayed." "Sometimes staying is harder," I said. "Sometimes it's also the only way to make what we owe fit into what we can do." She set the coffee down and tapped the fountain pen on my desk with her fingernail, like a small drum. "You used it," she said. "I saw you sign the plan." "I used it because Eleanor pressed it into my hand like a key," I said. "It remembers." Maya's face softened. "Do you regret it?" she asked. I thought of my mother's smile, the foreman in Seattle, Daniel's steady hand, Patricia's subtle strength, and the plant floor with its steady, honest noise. I thought of the pen's cool weight in my palm, and Eleanor's voice telling me to let time work when it must. "Sometimes," I said, "there are losses I can't recover, but I believe we've done better than we had a right to hope." The story does not end with a tidy moral. There are still mornings when I wake with the ache of decisions made and not made. There are still relationships that will not be repaired, and moments I cannot reclaim. But there is also a company that, for all its flaws, keeps its people at the center of the ledger. I keep Eleanor's final words framed on a shelf. They read, "You must choose. I trust you."
That trust is not a burden so much as a responsibility that steadies me when the city outside feels like a tide. The fountain pen lives in a small leather tray on my desk.
Sometimes I hold it when I'm tired and let the metal remind me that signatures create obligations. If you asked me now whether I would have done anything differently, I would say I would have tried to make space earlier for the small moments I missed. I would have answered my mother's calls more often. I would have learned sooner how to let people in without thinking the world would tilt. But I would not trade the learning. I would not trade the work of trying to make a company into something that remembers the people who make it. Some victories are not about applause. They are about staying when leaving is tempting, and doing the hard, often invisible labor of caring for a machine that feeds real lives. The tulips still tremble sometimes in the reception vase. The pen sometimes leaves a smudge on my memos when my hand is tired. And in the quiet, when the city has contracted to the sound of a few distant horns, I take that pen down and sign notes that read like promises instead of instruments of erasure. If this story moved you, like and subscribe. Share the moment that mattered most in the comments.